So we welcome you to the August Safe Church webinar. We want to give a special welcome to everyone who has not been virtually present for our previous webinars. For those of you who are not familiar with the Safe Church Ministry or the Christian Reformed Church, we are an agency of the Christian Reformed Church denomination, and it's our mission to equip congregations in abuse awareness, prevention, and response. My name is Eric Koss. I've been on staff with Safe Church as an associate for about 3.5 years, and I've been a church planter in the past as well. And I'm excited to be with you today and to also learn more from our special guest, Boz Tchividjian. Before we introduce Boz, we have a few other Safe Church staff who will introduce themselves as well.
And I'm Bonnie Nicholas. I'm the director of Safe Church Ministry, and I've been in this position almost 10 years now, first as an interim and then as director. So I'll be here a few more months until November, and it's been quite a journey. So we're very excited that this journey is continuing and that there's so much more awareness now than there used to be about abuse issues.
Hi, I'm Becky, and I am the volunteer and communication specialist for Safe Church. And I've been here for almost a year now, so very excited to be part of this and looking forward to hearing this webinar. Thank you for joining us.
And we're so thrilled today to have Boz Tchavidian with us. Were you going to say more about Safe Church, Eric? I'm sorry, before I do this.
I wasn't planning to, but I certainly can. I've been thrilled to be on staff with Safe Church, and we're doing a variety of things to address abuse issues in the Christian Reformed Church, and we also offer a variety of our resources to a variety of people. And so many of our resources are just available on our website, which you can find if you go to crcna.org/Safe Church, or you can Google it and some of our stuff comes up. And we're so glad to have so many Safe Church coordinators, who many of you are here with us today, working in different regions throughout North America. And we've been thrilled to be able to learn together through a variety of different situations and these kinds of educational events that we're able to host as a webinar. And so we are excited about next month. We will have Jay Stringer on as our webinar presenter. Jay is a licensed therapist, and he's also a Christian Reformed Church pastor, and he recently has written a book called Unwanted, which is a book about unwanted sexual brokenness and different levels of addiction. And so he's focused on shifting the paradigm of how the church really goes about our issues when it comes to addictions to sexual brokenness. And so welcome to our webinar again, and we're glad that you're here with us as Safe Church Ministry.
All right. So we're really thrilled today to have Boz Tchavidian with us. We were hoping that he was going to be able to join us in person at our Safe Church conference, but since that was canceled this fall, we're just so pleased that he was able to join us for this webinar. In 2004, Boz founded GRACE, which stands for Godly Response to Abuse in Christian Environments. And it works to empower Christian communities to recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse. And as a lawyer, Boz has prosecuted and supervised thousands of cases of sexual victimization. And he's used that experience that he gained as a prosecutor to train other prosecutors and investigators and social workers in handling various aspects of child sexual abuse. He's taught at Liberty University Law School, teaching a course that he designed in child abuse and the law. And he's been a columnist for Religious News Service, writing a weekly column that focuses on that intersection between faith and abuse. That's a fascinating intersection. And in addition, he's co-authored a book called The Child Safeguarding Policy Guide for Churches and Ministries. And so we are just thrilled to have him here with us today. So join me in welcoming Boz Tchavidian. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here. And lots of people Man, I don't think I've been in a Zoom room this big in a while, so that's pretty impressive.
Great. So Boz, let's start out. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your own story? What led you to found an organization like Grace?
Sure, I'll be brief on my own story because I don't want everybody falling asleep so early in our conversation. But I'll give you a little bit of a background of how I got here. You know, Bonnie, I grew up in a Christian home, you know, pretty traditional, conservative Christian home. Didn't know much about the issue of abuse growing up, though I did have a family member who had been sexually victimized, so I was aware of the issue. But it really wasn't until I went to law school and came back and began prosecuting here in Central Florida that my eyes were really open to the horrific aspect, so many horrific aspects of sexual abuse. And, you know, there's many things that prompted that. I obviously, the easy answer is God put that on, certainly put that on my heart at that moment in time. But, you know, you can't sit in a room with a 9-year-old girl and hear about how her father's best friend sexually abused her for years and not be moved. Not be moved to sadness, but also be moved to anger and wanting to do something to help that young person find justice. And you know, it was the same thing with adult victims. And so I just was really, that really fueled my passion and interest in this issue. And I was also really disappointed with how many people, even those in the prosecutor's office, didn't seem to care that much about these types of cases. I think, you know, and again, this would be a whole nother conversation, but I think these are tough cases to prosecute. The subject matter is incredibly difficult. But, you know, the proving and convicting these cases is difficult. You know, it's much easier to convict somebody of a drug transaction or a burglary or, quite frankly, even a homicide than a sexual assault or sexual abuse case. So I think a lot of prosecutors didn't see this as a winning area for them, and so they just either didn't prosecute these cases or they would plead these cases out. So these sex offenders are getting, you know, a few months in prison. And I just said, man, this is one of the most horrific offenses that exists, in my opinion, on the face of the earth. Why aren't we treating it that way? And so I ended up helping to start a sexual crimes unit of our office, and we brought in prosecutors within that unit who would be as passionate or more so than me on addressing this issue. But how I started Grace was that as I'm prosecuting these cases and overseeing the prosecution of these cases, thousands of these cases, I was struck by how many of these cases involved in some way, shape, or form a faith community. Whether the abuse occurred in a faith community or whether it occurred outside the faith community and the victim's family is bringing the matter to the attention of their pastor or their lay leaders. And almost every single time I was so devastated by the response of the church. And I cannot tell you how many survivors that I have been privileged to meet who have fled from faith communities because they have realized that this was not only the place where they were victimized, but it was also the place that where they were re-victimized by church leaders and wanted nothing to do with God or church or anything. And quite frankly, I didn't blame them. And so when I got out, was in private practice, really began to think through, and I won't go through the whole story of how it started, but really became clear that what if I took what I learned on the front lines and use that to train and equip Christians and faith communities and churches, so that maybe one day, the church will be a place where the hurting and the wounded flee towards and not from. And so we started Grace in 2004, as you said. Didn't know exactly what we were doing, but I remember meeting in the cramped back office of Dr. Diane Langberg up in Philadelphia with a group of us, and we didn't know what the future held, but God did. And here we are in 2020, and you know, we're busting at the seams with individuals and organizations and various faith communities seeking our help and guidance. And so in one sense, that's really encouraging because that has significantly increased in the last few years. But it's also a very sober reminder that this issue this issue pervades all aspects of our culture and society, and especially inside faith communities. So I'm stepping down from being the executive director of Grace in just a few months. I've returned. Actually, I left the law school at Liberty, and based on the information that's come out in the last few days, I probably left at a great time. And back into private practice, where I am really focusing on my practice in representing victims of sexual abuse and sexual assault against perpetrators and organizations and institutions that have repeatedly failed them. And so it's a great honor for me to do that, and to be able to convey whatever 2 cents of knowledge that I have with this incredible group that each of you, and I don't know, just know a few of you, but just from what I've been told, the fact that you're taking time out of your busy lives to put towards this issue is a huge encouragement to me and our team, because I can tell you, I wish this was something that was much more common inside the church. So just a bit of encouragement to you all to thank you for your involvement and your interest in learning more about this, so you can go back to your respective churches and help transform their culture into places of refuge and safety for vulnerable people, and places that are not safe for those who abuse.
Thank you. I love that, of churches being a place that people who have survived abuse run towards instead of away from. That's such a great image. I remember once listening to a recording where you were talking, I think it was to a gathering of Southern Baptists, but you kind of retold the Good Samaritan story with a twist about who the different characters in that story were. And it was so moving to me and so powerful. And it really brought up the urgency and the importance of listening to the voices of people who have experienced abuse. So how would you answer that question for us today? Why is it so important for churches to listen to the voices of those who have suffered abuse? And what can that do for the church?
Because I think we see over and over again that Jesus did. Over and over. Jesus was always moving towards the individual, never the crowd. He was always moving to the vulnerable and the marginalized, the hurting and the wounded. That's the story of the Good Samaritan. The religious folks, the people who were actively involved in the church, were too busy to notice. They would notice. Sometimes they notice, but too busy to actually take steps to serve the hurting and the wounded. And then what I find so interesting about that story is the very one who had every legal justification, I'll speak as a lawyer, to walk up to that person laying on the side of the road and actually probably take whatever more they could from that person, didn't. What did they do? They noticed, they moved towards, they got into the dirt with that person, lifted them up to safety. And one of the things somebody recently told me, and I think it's really true, is it took a lot of courage for that Samaritan to do what he did. Not only because he was moving towards a Jew that he knew probably hated him, but this was a very dangerous route. I mean, this is like going to a place in an area of town, regardless of where, that that it's dangerous. Here's a guy that was just beat up by robbers, and it could very well happen to that Good Samaritan as well, as he's trying to help this wounded Jewish person. And what did he do? He didn't let that stop him. So there was great challenge. There was reason to be fearful, but he took great courage in doing what he did. And I think to me, that can be an inspiration to those of us inside the church who do want to move towards the wounded and the hurting, who do, get into the dirt with them and help to lift them to safe places, and are really nervous and scared along the way because of how others might respond, or what type of pushback we may get from church leaders, or that we may even lose some of our church community because of what we're doing. To be reminded of that parable, that, it takes a lot of courage. And this is not for the faint of heart. And for any of you all who are here, you probably know that. But I love that because it's a picture of who we are to be as the church. And I think we have largely, not everywhere, we have largely forgotten that. I think we have largely forgotten what Jesus looks like. And we have gotten so caught up in church that the wounded who are laying inside of our churches are too nervous and too scared to even speak because of the response that they may get from those around them. And that's awful. I mean, if you think about the church as the place, is the supposedly the community that loves and adores Jesus and confesses to follow him and to be obedient to him and want to be his image bearers. That should be the place where the most wounded feel the most safe to step forward and to know that they will be embraced and loved. And that's not what we find in so many of our churches today. And so our churches are filled with abuse survivors who are suffering in silence because they don't have a safe space. And so one of the things Grace is working to do, amongst many others, is how do we transform the culture of Christendom to make it that safe space for wounded people, and to make it a safe space for vulnerable people who may be subject to abuse, not only inside the doors of the church, but let's face it, most abuse occurs at home. And how many of our congregation members, how many of our kids in our churches are being physically or sexually or even spiritually abused at home, and we're not even thinking about that. And I would say in a day of COVID, especially since many churches aren't meeting, that should be even higher on our radar screen as church leaders and church members on what could be going on inside the homes of our church members, and not to assume that because they're a member of our church that all is well, because I can tell you all is not well.
Yes, I think, yeah, and it really has the power to transform our churches as we live into that role and really see God's healing power at work in our churches.
Yeah.
Okay, so another thing that Grace does is do assessments for churches and organizations. And so tell us a little about how you go about conducting an assessment of the culture in an organization or a church, and what are maybe some of the factors that you look for? Are there factors that are healthy? Are there factors that are kind of red flags or show that this is not a safe culture? What are some of those things you look for in an assessment, and how do you go about that?
So on that wing of the organization, we focus on what we call independent investigations and assessments. So the difference between an investigation and an assessment is an investigation is where a church comes to us and says, hey, this person just stepped forward and disclosed this bit of information and about abuse and connected to our church in some fashion. And we absolutely feel committed and are committed to addressing this, but we don't know how to do it. Could you come in as a third party, it's independent from the church, and investigate this, and then bring forth the findings of the investigation to us and make recommendations? And so we'll do that. And we also bring the findings of the investigation, not just to the church leaders, but we also bring those exact same findings to the victims that we've met with, because they are absolutely entitled to see as much as we give the church in what we learned. Because there's no secrecy. Transparency can mean credibility. And so that's the investigation side. But then sometimes we have a situation where an organization or church comes in and says, we don't have a pending matter that we're facing, but we do have some concerns. We had an organization about a year and a half ago, a large organization, say, we've had a number of complaints from female members about how they believe they are being mistreated, how they're being minimized, their value is being overlooked. Some men won't even look at them in the eyes when they're talking to them. I mean, just this treating the females within that community as second-class citizens, if at best. And they said, this seems to be a cultural problem with our organization, but we don't know even where to begin. And so we stepped in and did a cultural assessment of that. And again, each cult assessment is a little different because we create a scope for the assessment based upon what that organization is coming forward and is disclosed to us as their concerns. But one of the things that we do in both investigations and assessments, which is really, really helpful, is we want to hear from those that are outside of the realms of power within the organization. because we find that if all we're doing is communicating and interviewing with leadership, with those in power, we are missing probably the most important demographic of that community. And let's face it, especially in churches, people don't feel comfortable stepping up and confronting power as long as those people remain in power. And so it's amazing and tragic how many people in Christian communities remain silent, even though they have legitimate concerns about somebody who has power within that community, because they know that if they bring that forward, what the result will be, and that is people will surround the person with power and support that person, and this very person may find themselves without community. And so so how do you do that in an assessment? You know, saying, well, the grace team's going to be at the church from 1 to 4, come by and share your thoughts about the church, doesn't work. People don't feel comfortable doing that for the most part. And so what we do is we create an online survey. And we create an online survey that is confidential but not anonymous. And we will ask questions dealing with the very issues that are related to the scope of that assessment. So, for example, we would ask, broad-based questions, like in the example I just gave you, asking the recipients of that and the respondents, of that survey, to disclose whether or not they've ever noticed a female being mistreated or treated any differently than a male, and if so, could they provide us an example? And just those, and then we get into more specifics. We allow for these surveys to provide, if somebody says, there was an issue that I saw a year or two ago where there was abuse, but I've never reported it, we provide that as an opportunity for that person to step forward and report it. And so what that does is it allows people oftentimes outside the realms of power to sit at home in the safety of their home on their computer, knowing that what they're communicating to us is confidential, and it allows them to share in a safe space. And what we learn through those surveys is amazing, because we will often think one thing about the church and the church culture, primarily because we've only been talking to leadership. And then we receive the responses to these surveys and we go, whoa, this is a much different place than what we have been told. And sometimes the leadership is aware of that, and sometimes they're not. There's such a big disconnect between leadership and those who have power and those outside the realms of power. And so what it does ultimately is it does empower others in the church to speak up. And part of the assessment process is, how do you create a culture within the church that invites, not just allows, but that encourages and invites those who may not be in positions of authority or power to speak freely and to speak safely. And let me tell you, that is a challenge. And I'm sure many who are here today would vouch for me in having experienced that in some fashion. And that's got to change. And there are some churches that I have a lot of hope for in that regard, and there are many that I don't. And part of that goes to, and that's a whole different topic for another day, is just the whole structure of church life in America today. Is that really what Jesus intended, to create power, and those with power, those without power, and what do those with power do, and what it's complicated. But in those where there's a huge differential in power, that's oftentimes where we see the most abuse occur.
Yeah, I like that reference to power. Our denomination is looking at some of those power dynamics more closely. That's really helpful. Thanks.
Yeah.
So a lot of us here are either Safe Church team members, coordinators, or ministry leaders. What if we attend a church where nobody really cares about this issue, or they don't see the importance of it? Do you have any ideas for us, or action steps, or things that we can do to help churches become more aware if they're not there at all yet?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think it's a very relevant question. I think the one thing to know going into those situations is to realize that in every church in this country today, there are survivors of physical and sexual abuse sitting in the pews. And just because a church is not talking about it, just because they may be overlooking it, does not mean that issue is not incredibly relevant to that particular community. It may mean that those who have survived the abuse simply have never felt the safety to speak of it. And it could be because of the environment that you've just described. And oftentimes that environment is either we're not thinking about it or we just don't think it's an issue for us. You know, that abuse is an issue that happens out there and not in here. And we see that a lot in churches today is the church. I see this primarily, but not always, in more conservative churches where we lay on blast the terrible culture that's going to hell. And we talk a lot about the terrible culture we're living in. But man, we're really uneasy when we start realizing that, but what about all the stuff inside of our community? We don't talk about that because it's much easier to point out there than it is to begin addressing the deep hurts and evils oftentimes found inside of our own churches. So know, that there are survivors in that church, and that should motivate you to not give up because you are an advocate. B, I think that one thing to do, I think one of the first steps to take is to talk to leadership and to say, hey, I've noticed, even ask this question. Hey, do you all have a child protection policy? And see how they respond. If they say, well, yeah, we do. Why do you want to see it? Not a good response. If they say, we don't have one, that's not a good response. Even if they say, yeah, we have one, and they give it to you, follow up. Well, where'd you all get this? How did you all go through a process in drafting this? Oh, we got it from our insurance company. Well, that's a red flag right there. If your child protection policy is primarily given to you by your insurance company, that tells you that it's primarily focused on limiting liability of the church and not focused on protecting vulnerable people. And so, start with that, because that'll give you a little bit of a gauge of where that church is on those issues. But then I would say the other thing is speak to leadership. Say, I need time to talk to some of the leaders. I would go straight to the senior pastor and say, here's a concern. I'm noticing that this is an issue that doesn't seem to be addressed or spoken about much in this church. I've not found a child protection policy, or there's one that was drafted years ago that nobody knows about. It sits on a shelf collecting dust. That concerns me because this issue, as you know, transcends all boundaries, including the boundaries of this church. And is there something we can do to begin to change that? And gauge the response. If the response is a positive one and says, oh my goodness, we've completely overlooked this, and what could we do? Can you help us along the way? That's a good step forward. If the response is, thank you for sharing that, we'll take care of it, that's not a good response. And that's what you see a lot of times because people with power want to hold on to their power. So thank you for telling us. Now you need to go away and we'll take care of it. And more times out of not, they're not taking care of it. So you'd want them to invite you to participate in assessing and working on this issue. Sometimes we do this with our safeguarding initiative. The church will bring together a safeguarding committee or team of people in the church who have an interest in this. Maybe they're survivors, maybe they're a relative of a survivor, maybe they're a retired police officer, maybe they're a therapist, but who have a real interest, and they come together and actually work together in drafting policies and protocols that the church then can take ownership as their own. And they'll work with experts like Grace in developing that. So those are the positive things. I would say if you keep hitting a brick wall, if you talk to leadership, if you talk to the pastor and they're not responsive, I guess the next round is, are there people in the church? You go to the other end of the spectrum. Are there people in the church that can begin raising their voices on this? Oftentimes it's a challenge because people don't want to stir the pot in a church. Most people don't. And the people who usually do have been labeled by the leadership as a troublemaker, and thus they minimize that person's voice, which is unfortunate. And so oftentimes what I tell people is if you keep hitting that brick wall, you need to leave that church. It's not a safe place. And you can only do what you can do. You can't control the behavior of others. And if the people in leadership and the congregation as a whole aren't invested in working together to be image bearers of Jesus by making this church the safest place for vulnerable people, then just because it calls itself a church doesn't mean it is one. And move elsewhere.
Yeah, thanks for that. Those are good ideas. I only have one more question, and so I just want to remind people that I hope you're putting your questions in the chat box, and we hope that you've also introduced yourself in the chat box so we kind of know who's here, so that would be helpful. But I want to ask you a final question. Is there a question that you wish we would have asked you, or is there something else that you're just burning to tell us right now in this context?
No, I guess, no, maybe it's me throwing back the question to you all, and that is with each of those who are here today, what are you all finding collectively, but also individually, as some of your greatest challenges in addressing this issue and doing the work that you have stepped forward to and volunteered to do within your own denomination? I think that'd be a helpful discussion point, because I think that I'd be willing to guess that there are many challenges, and there may be a lot of challenges that people think they are uniquely facing. When they begin speaking together, they realize, oh, this is a common challenge. And if it's a common challenge, then maybe there's a bit larger question to ask, and that is, why is this a challenge? And does this have something more to do with the culture of the denomination and the leadership, or something else? And to begin wrestling through that and maybe coming up with some suggested ways forward collectively.
That sounds like a great idea for a Safe Church team meeting. Coordinators, let's talk about our greatest challenges. And we do hope that Safe Church offers some networking opportunities with one another so we can learn from each other as well. So thanks. I'm going to turn it over to Becky now, who's going to lead us in a time of Q&A from your questions. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. This is Boz. Thank you so much for everything you've discussed so far. I've had about 2 or 3 questions come up in chat, so I'm going to start with those, and then for sure, as I'm sure as people are starting to get comfortable with chat, and that we'll get some more questions. For anybody that isn't comfortable or know how to use chat, basically when you hover over the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little bar that pops up that says chat, and you just click on it, and then you can type away, and it should automatically just say everyone, so we can all see your questions. So just wanted to let everybody know that. So my first question is from Gretchen, and her question is, many pastors believe pedophiles can be cured. What is your view on this? She's seen no literature that would show evidence to support this.
Yeah, that's, probably the issue that we face. One of the greatest obstacles when we go into churches is the issue of offenders and reported offenders. And that is, there's this notion amongst lots of church leaders and members that if this person, if this offender, now we're just talking about known offenders. There are oftentimes many unknown offenders in churches, but known offenders, that if this person confesses and says they're sorry and maybe even serve from prison time, they should be 110% welcome back into the church community, and we should move forward, because they have been, many would argue they're new creatures in Christ, and therefore we can't hold that against them, and so we move forward, and that they will change. And I would say, from an anecdotal response, based on my years of work doing this, that's simply not true. And what I've seen, I could maybe count on one hand, if I know the full truth, and I don't know if I know the full truth of sexual offenders who have not reoffended. They do reoffend, and there are various types of sex offenders. There's opportunistic ones. There's the high-risk offenders. And we won't have time to go into all of those, but what pastors and some Christians don't understand is that you can't treat somebody who has sexually victimized a child like somebody who got caught, stealing a car 5 years ago. It's the dynamics are so different, and that you have to challenge them to read and learn. Read Anna Salter's book, Predators. This is a woman, a psychologist, Harvard-trained psychologist, who has spent years interviewing confessed sex offenders. When you're done reading that book, you'll realize, whoa, have I been deceived, or have I been deceived by those in my congregation that are known sex offenders? And now people say, well, you don't think known sex offenders should be a part of the church. Well, I think there are certain limitations. Absolutely. I've said, and many people disagree with me, I think somebody who sexually victimized a child should not be a part of corporate worship. Somebody who's sexually victimized a child should be very limited in the role they play in the local church. And quite frankly, somebody who's sexually victimized a child, before you can even begin having a conversation with that person about even the possibility of a remote degree of involvement in the church, they have to be 110% truthful. And that's where it breaks down, because the sex offenders I've encountered through my 20 plus years of doing this work are liars. And they will lie to you, and they're the best liars. They will convince you. In fact, you will even sometimes walk away feeling guilty because they're narcissistic as well, and going, man, they're making me feel guilty because I'm telling them that they can't serve in nursery or they can't participate in this particular church activity. And why am I the one walking away feeling like I'm being judgmental and narrow-minded? That is a strategy, and you have to become educated about these things. And so until you know 110% that they're telling the truth, you can't trust them. If you can't trust them, you certainly would not put them even remotely near any vulnerable member of your church congregation. And let me tell you something, churches are filled with vulnerable people, and it's just not the kids, and it's not just the elderly people. And so to answer your question, I would say that one of the things I think churches make a mistake on is they take all the information about an offender and they get it from one source, and it's the offender. And I tell churches all of the time, have you verified anything this person has told you? There are ways to verifying it. Are they minimizing what they've told you? You got to do the homework, and it takes a lot of work. You got to roll up your sleeves and do it. And I've just found most church leaders rather not do the hard work. And that makes me concerned, because I'm like, Jesus left the 99 to go after the one. Talk about hard work. That was really hard work. And why aren't we doing the same aren't the vulnerable people in our church entitled to just that? So yeah, are there some that have changed? I'm sure there have been some, but it's hard to know. And that's the tough part about it. And if you don't know, if you have to veer on the side of safety of kids and vulnerable people or ticking off a reported offender, you know what? Tick off the reported offender, because your role as a church leader and as a church member ultimately is to be the good Samaritan, and that is the one that moves towards the hurting and the vulnerable, and not to try to appease somebody who might be yelling at you that you're being unjust. Because let me tell you, if you have truly sexually victimized a child and you're truly repentant about it, in my opinion, your response to any of this will be, I will submit myself to your leadership and your direction without complaint, period. And we very, very seldom see that. More often than not, you get a lot of pushback from reported offenders. Why am I being treated this way? This is not fair. And that's always a red flag that nothing has changed. But oftentimes that strategy works with church leaders, because as my friend Diane Langbert says, Christians often love to find redemption stories where they simply don't exist.
Thanks. I'm going to ask one more question of you, and I just wasn't sure if Bonnie or Eric have a particular one that they've seen come up in chat that they want to really jump on. But one of the questions that I wanted to just follow up with was, you had talked about for a safe church team, like going to their council or the pastor to ask about policies. But I'm wondering, if someone's just coming into the church, how can we know that it's a safe church? What are some key aspects that we'd look for that when you're talking about a safe church, and when to move on and when you can feel comfortable?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would say I don't think any church is safe. I think we can say, what's a safer church? What's a church that's aware of these issues and are constantly working on them and constantly making the safeguarding issue part of the very DNA of who they are. And I think if you're walking into a church, the way you find out whether or not that church may be one of those, or one of those who just don't think this is important, is what I said earlier, is asking questions. And observing. I mean, take time to observe. Just little things like, how do they run and operate their nursery? Do you see that there is organization, are there policies with regard to how those nursery and youth programs are operated? But I guess I go back to, I really think because it's worked for us, is does that church even have a policy and procedure dealing with child safeguarding? If they don't, that's a huge problem. That tells me that that is not a safer church. But then the next question, and probably the most important question is it a church that wants to be? So that's one of the ways you can identify. Now, now I will say this too, just because a church has such a policy doesn't mean they're a safer church, because they may have such a policy as I talked about earlier, but have never looked at it or know nothing about it other than what their insurance agent told them. So observing, asking questions, and then gauging the response to those questions will give you a pretty good indication of whether or not this is a safer church. And if it's not, whether it's one that has a heart to become one, or whether it's one that is simply not interested in hearing from you. And if they're not interested in hearing from you, I don't think you walk away immediately, because I think you gotta be persistent, and you gotta check to see if are there any people in leadership that do think this is important. Are there any people in the church congregation that see this as important? And if you walk away and going, you know what, I've tried and I'm not finding anybody here, then I would say put your resources and time elsewhere, and because it's not a safe place, and you can't make a church safe. That's one thing I want you all to remember, is you can help and you can come alongside and be a support and provide resources, but you cannot make a church safe. That church has to make that decision for itself, and you can encourage it, give them the right tools in moving in that direction, but you can't make that church become safe. So if they don't want to be, there's not much you can do, sadly.
Yeah, thanks for all your comments and your experience, Boz. We had another question come through, a variety of them, and one that piqued my interest was one from Amy, and she shared just a bit of her experience with raising an allegation, especially one that happened such a long time ago, and that brought up to my curiosity just a variety of questions in how to go about sharing these allegations to a church. I'm reminded of Rachel Den Hollander and her experience with Larry Nassar at MSU, and just the fact that so many people are not believed and they face that rejection. And so I guess what would be your encouragement to somebody who finally is ready to deal with issues or being victimized by abuse such a long time ago? How should they go about processing that in the present?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's an area where so many people have been so hurt because they have an expectation that their church is going to respond in one way, and when the church doesn't, they're devastated. And I've talked to more survivors who have told me that the abuse they suffered was traumatic and that they will have to process that for the rest of their lives. But what was as traumatic or even more damaging to them was the response of the church. Because that has so many other, just because they had an expectation of safety and support where they didn't receive it. And oftentimes people look at churches as the representative of God here on earth. And therefore, what does that mean? What does this say about God and how God responds to my disclosure? I would say first, you can't do it alone. Do not do it alone. You have to have a support network. And so that's got to be some buddy or buddies that you trust that have been walking with you through this journey at some level, whether it's a therapist, a good friend, family members, because there's a strong likelihood that when you step forward, depending on the dynamics of the situation, that you are not going to be welcomed with open arms. And what I find, and this is, again, there's always exceptions to this, is that if you are coming forward and disclosing about an offender who is not, oh, sorry, that's my daughter calling, that is no longer part of the church, or is, let's say, has deceased, there's a likelihood that the response will be a little bit better because there's not that conflict. That person is gone. And therefore, there's a much greater willingness to hear you and to say, hey, we want to do something about it, whether they mean it or not. But where you really begin to have the problem is when the offender is still a part of that community. And then you've got, and oftentimes the offender, if the offender is a leader in the church, keep in mind that leader has a relationship with all the other leaders in the church. And so you stepping forward will create a dynamic that's going to force that leadership to make a decision. Are we going to become focused on the reported victim, or are we going to protect our friend, the other person in power? And as you all have all seen, more often times than not, it's the latter. But that doesn't mean you don't come forward, because you come forward, A, to speak truth about your own experience, and you do so to protect others who could be also victimized by this individual in the future, or there may be other victims who are suffering in silence from that particular victim. And so you do step forward. And, you know, I think that there's various types of responses. I mean, if the church responds well, one of the ways you know a church responds well is when it doesn't keep it quiet. Now, that doesn't mean it'll expose your identity and tell everybody, no, but when the church says, well, let's try to deal with this quietly, that's not a good response, because you are bringing light to a dark space. And if the church is trying to dim that light, it is inconsistent not only with the very gospel they preach, but it is also doesn't serve you or the others who could be potential victims in that space. And you know, hopefully, and this is why our safeguarding initiative I think is so important, is the key is to create these protocols beforehand, so that when somebody steps forward at church, even if it's, let's say I'm a pastor and the allegations are against the youth pastor who is a very close friend of mine, if I don't have a protocol in place, what's going to happen? I'm going to deal with this allegation, probably whether I want to or not, going to be dealing with it differently than if the allegation was made about the janitor that we just hired 2 weeks ago. I'm going to handle it differently. But if we have a protocol in place where we go, you know what, as hard as this is, I'm actually really grateful that we have a step-by-step protocol that will guide and direct us on what to do when an allegation comes forward that I can turn to. And so that everybody that steps forward will come in contact with a process that is uniform and consistent. And that's where we work with churches to do that. But even if you do have a protocol in place, that doesn't always mean that you're going to be, like I said, welcomed with open arms and heralded for stepping forward. I think younger church leaders and younger pastors, I'm seeing in a lot of churches, get this issue much more than the older generation. And the older generation is still under the guise of, and again, this is a generalization, not always true, of just let's try to keep this quiet. This could be an embarrassment to the church. This is another one. Could be an embarrassment to the gospel or Jesus, so let's keep it quiet. And man, that is terrible advice. And what does that tell a victim? It says that I should be ashamed of what happened to me, and therefore I'm going to keep quiet because I don't want to tarnish the reputation of Jesus. No, Jesus doesn't, I say this all the time, he doesn't need us for his reputation. And actually the reputation of Jesus is about truth and light and not evil and darkness. But anyway, so that's a very long response to a fairly short question that we could spend really the whole time talking about, because it is one that has caused so much suffering when it really didn't need to. And it not only creates suffering amongst victims, but when a church responds other than embracing that survivor and being their advocate and moving forward, when they respond in any other way, they empower the offender. And that offender will continue to offend. And then we wonder why so many of them feel so comfortable in so many of our churches.
Thanks, Boz. That's very helpful. Thank you. So I have one other question I want to touch on, but just prior to that, I just want to thank everybody that's putting so much in chat. It's been wonderful, and just the conversations that have been going back and forth as well, and the resources that have been provided in chat. I'm very thankful for all that, and I'm so glad that we have this space. This is exactly what it's for. So thank you. The one question I had was just in terms of, as we're building our policies and processes, how do we build in the aspect of recognizing emotional abuse as well as physical and sexual abuse?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that is, emotional abuse is complicated, because physical abuse and sexual abuse can oftentimes be objectively identified. Where you get into emotional abuse, it's what may be emotional abuse to me may not be emotional abuse to you. And and therefore you get into a challenge of trying to outline specifically, this is emotional abuse, this is not. Whereas it's I think it's more advisable to say what are, based on research and resources. So you got to look towards that. Don't just do it on your own. What are examples in general from 1,000 feet up of types of behaviors, interpersonal behaviors that can be hurtful and wounding to other people? And let's flush those out a little bit, and then let's talk about how do we train and equip our people on understanding that and how to identify that. And even if you might see something that you may see that you go, man, that I just saw an interaction between two people and there was no physical contact, there's no sexual contact, but what I just witnessed was troubling, but I feel really uncomfortable saying anything to anybody because maybe it's just me, maybe I'm being too sensitive. You have to create an environment in your church where people who are observing those types of behaviors feel safe to step forward and know who they should speak with. And oftentimes we see emotional abuse, as many of you probably know, from those in leadership. Pastors, unfortunately, are notorious at being emotionally and spiritually abusive because many of them are narcissists. Not all, but many of them. And so that's the last person in the world that you want to say, wait, excuse me, I'm seeing something here that's not comfortable. But keep in mind, if you've observed something, whether it's a pastor or somebody else, that you are uncomfortable with an interaction, there's a great likelihood that others have seen those interactions as well and may just be all keeping silent and being in their own silos out of fear. And so that creates, Becky, the importance of developing a policy and protocol so that if you do notice something, that the church actually has embraced a protocol that says, if you notice something, regardless of who it is and regardless of what you've noticed, here's who you should speak with. And it shouldn't be the senior pastor. That would be a mistake, because we don't want to continue to say, okay, those who are seeing these things, go to all the people in power, because they can be part of that conversation, but not exclusively part of that conversation. So I think it goes to a really good issue, because I think emotional abuse and spiritual abuse within churches is rampant, and many of us have been abused and quite frankly don't even realize it until we're away from the situation and going, wow, that was really oppressive. We went to a church for many years, and it wasn't until after we left that church, I looked at my wife when they go, man, that was such an oppressive environment. I didn't really realize it at the time until I've gotten out and have actually been able to breathe some oxygen and realize how hurtful that place was and how many other wounded people are just like us who are still there. And so, yeah, beginning by educating and creating those policies and procedures to address and help empower people to step forward, to speak about what they witnessed, even if maybe they end up being incorrect, maybe say that they saw only part of an interaction, I don't know, but they should still feel empowered to speak up, and what they say should be listened to and encouraged and not rebuffed.
Thanks so much. I do have one other question, unless Eric or Bonnie, you have one that you want to jump into to ask.
Feel free, Becky. Yeah.
Okay, then I just wanted to just go back to one earlier, because I know you touched on it a little bit, Boz, just in terms of your own world with liberty. I just wanted to know your thoughts. This is from one person. Thoughts on what's going on with celebrity spiritual leaders that are being exposed for sexual immorality. I think it'd be great to just talk about that.
That's a whole nother.
I know that's.
Yeah. Well, the fact that we have celebrity Christians and celebrity pastors says it all to me. We've created these worlds in Christendom, and most oftentimes in the evangelical world, that I just as a Christian don't recognize as consistent with the character of Jesus. And so then we're surprised when we put these individuals, mostly men, up in these positions with zero accountability, a lot of power, and then they abuse that power and then we're shocked and surprised by it. Now, I'm not taking away the responsibility that they have. They are the ones who have abused that power. They shouldn't get severance packages. They shouldn't be allowed to resign. They should be terminated. If I did that type of behavior, engage in that type of behavior as a lawyer, my bar license would be revoked and I wouldn't be able to practice law anymore. Now, does that mean that I'll never be able to do anything constructive in my life? No, of course. Hopefully I would be able to do some constructive thing, but not as a lawyer. But what are we doing in the church? We put these people in these positions, they abuse people, and then they go away for a little while, and then they come back and we welcome them and accept them and place them right back in those types of positions because we worship a God of forgiveness. And what really irritates me is, what about all the damaged people and wounded people left on the sides of the roads from these abusers? Nobody cares about them. They've all moved on, and now we've put this person back in this position, and we hold them up. So yeah, it's sad, it's tragic, it's disgusting, it's angering. I could go on and on. But I'm glad, at least in the case of Liberty, that light is coming to surface. And I think there's a lot more. I mean, darkness is coming to surface. Darkness is coming to light. And I think there's a lot more that's going to continue. But the last thing I would say, and I think it's related to Liberty, but also churches, is what role do sessions and board of trustees play in all of this? I mean, we have boards and sessions and other church structures are put there. One reason, a big reason, is for accountability purposes. And so many of these boards are handpicked by these leaders. Bill Hybels is a great, tragic example of that. He picked all the elders, and they're all his friends. And so when things begin to surface, there's nobody that's willing to go, wait a minute, our job is to hold you accountable, and we're going to step forward and do that. They don't do it. And so what ends up happening is more people get wounded, more people get damaged, more victims, and more victims. And so I think boards have to be held responsible too, because they have failed when those things happen. Anyway, I'll stop there, but that's my response.
That's awesome. Thank you. I'm going to throw it over to Eric now. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again, Boz. So many things that I think Bonnie and I and Becky and so many other Safe Church leaders have been thinking and conversing about has kind of been talked about. And so how do we as the church truly acknowledge the abuse of power that takes place, and that we don't just defend the name of Jesus, but we allow darkness to be, the things that are in the darkness to be seen. And there are so many things that we can be doing. And unfortunately, during this challenging time of COVID, we've had a lot of other distractions. And so we do hope that we can, as the church, continue to press forward, especially with the gospel. That in my opinion, this is a gospel issue. This is a way that Jesus and his incredible grace is able to be shown, not only for those who are survivors of abuse, but also to the entire church, because we're all broken, and we all need to practice that humility and vulnerability, and look at these issues and say we need to do something about it, and place something within our structures so that we can prevent it, so we can raise more awareness, so that more emphasis is given to this for our leaders, and that we're prepared. And so thank you for your words and sharing more about this. And we hope that that we can continue to be in relationship with you, and blessings to you in your work as you transition to Florida, and all the different things that you will encounter. And blessings to all of you who were present here with us. We hope and pray that we're able to take this and that a few actionable steps will be able to be formed by this, and we can make a difference in our communities and in our churches. So blessings.
Thank you so much. Privilege to be with all of you. Keep doing what you're doing. You're not alone.
Yeah. Thank you. And if you are interested in another webinar, we have another webinar next month, September 30th at the end of the month with Jay Stringer. So farewell. Bye-bye.